The President of the United States.
These United States are confronted with an economic affliction of great proportions.
America may be headed for a recession.
And I must say to you that the state of the union is not good.
I think one of the lessons of that period, and these lessons have to be learned and relearned, is don't let the inflation get started, because once it gets some momentum, it's kind of feeling that it's inevitable. We'll find ourselves back in the days of stagflation and unacceptable economic performance, and very difficult to deal with. There's a little flavor of that at the moment.
I want you to imagine for a moment that you are an employer and you've got some problems with your employees. When you hired these employees, they promised they would do exactly what you asked of them. But once they got the job, they became a nightmare. They stopped listening to you and started using the job to line their own pockets. They took the company credit card and racked up more debt than you could afford to pay back. They became so obsessed with keeping their jobs that they forgot to do their jobs. And after all that failure, all that disappointment, and all that incompetence, your employees came to you and said, "We deserve a raise." If you're a reasonable person, that should make your blood boil. And yet, that is exactly what it feels like to be an American taxpayer.
We are engaged in a long and hard fight against inflation.
Our trade deficit is too large.
Part of our trouble is that we have been self-indulgent, and now the bill has come due.
This is an NBC News special report.
All kinds of economic indicators turning south. New foreclosure stats out today and the like. Tim, these are tough times for the president to face the press.
He is hearing it from everybody in his own party, the opposition party, and from the American people. Prices are skyrocketing, and they're asking, what's the government going to do about it?
The Paul Revere of America these days is David Walker, the Comptroller General, who is absolutely dedicated to the idea of bringing to the attention of the Congress and the American people the fiscal crisis is looming out there.
The United States is not exempt from the laws of prudent finance. The American people understand that. You can't spend more money than you make, charge the credit card to an unlimited fashion without having some day of reckoning. That's just a fact.
The first three words in our Constitution are "we the people." It's written larger than anything else because the framers of that document, the architects of our republic, wanted to remind you at all times who's in charge. We the people. We are your employers, and you have an obligation to listen to us. So I come to you with a message from the American people. We demand term limits for members of Congress.
With respect to the fiscal crisis looming out there in the future, we'll see whether a democracy can deal with an obvious problem that's going to be present in not too many years, and the earlier we take action to deal with it, the better.
In fact, according to the most recent national polls on the issue, 82% of Americans want term limits. That includes support from 89% of Republicans, 76% of Democrats, and 83% of independent voters. This is not a left or right issue. This is an American issue. In fact, term limits could be the only issue with support from both President Trump and former President Obama.
We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow.
We must solve problems, not leave them to future generations.
We won't leave it to our children and our grandchildren.
We must not go back to unwise spending.
We must strive to break the calamitous cycle and help dispel the uncertainty that so many feel about our economy.
I have served in Washington on multiple occasions under Democratic and Republican presidents. I've never seen Washington so out of touch and out of control.
Now, there was a time about 25 years ago when Congress was debating this. Nearly every opponent of term limits up here had the same rebuttal: experience, experience, experience. We need experience to do this job right. If only you leave your Congress member in office for decades on end, he or she will become such a policy expert that all our problems will be solved. In hindsight, that was one of the worst predictions ever. This system is broken.
Article V of the U.S. Constitution describes the ways that the Constitution can be amended, which has happened 27 times as of 2019, first with the Bill of Rights and 17 times since. The only way it's ever been done has been through a 2/3 majority vote by Congress. But there's also another way to amend the Constitution. That is for 2/3 of the states to call for a convention to propose an amendment. If 34 states call for a convention, Congress is required to schedule one. And at this convention, an amendment can be proposed. Congress then sends the proposed amendment out to the states for ratification, meaning each state legislature now gets to vote on whether to keep or scrap the amendment produced by the convention. If, and only if, 3/4 of the states ratify it, the proposed amendment would then become law.
A stronger nation and economy requires more than a balanced budget.
Only a true partnership between government and the people can ever hope to reach these goals.
This is the Federal Reserve. They're holding the Federal Reserve rate down at extraordinarily low levels in order to be able to help the government deal with its debt. It has expanded its balance sheet dramatically. It's buying most of the new debt in order to hold interest rates down. It is basically self-dealing with U.S. debt.
Politically speaking, the cost of corruption can be kept off the books through the use of unlimited debt.
If you're only going to pay for half of something and you're going to finance the rest with government debt, then every new spending program feels cheaper.
If there's no immediate cost to people, then there's an incentive here for members of Congress to keep spending or keep creating new programs.
And so what the tax plan that we're putting forward does is it lowers rates.
Here's a tax cut. Here's a brand new sparkly program. Don't worry, it won't hurt the economy. It will pay for itself. That's pretty tempting, so people are going to respond to that. So you have political parties that are preferring that message, which is a lot easier.
Between 75 and 80% of the American people want a balanced budget amendment. They know there's something fundamentally wrong with borrowing money every year to pay for your government.
I have given up on it happening through Congress. So clearly, Washington is unlikely to fix this issue. I do believe that it might eventually happen through Congress, but only when there is the pressure from the states.
So total debt subject to the debt ceiling, which has been suspended for a few more days, $27.1 trillion. Total pension retiree health care obligations, $9.4 trillion. Other commitments and contingencies, $0.1 trillion. Unfunded Social Security Medicare obligations, $65.5 trillion. The real number is not $21 trillion. It's not $28 trillion. It's $102 trillion.
The incumbent advantage creates a barrier to entry for everyday Americans without the connections to fund a campaign. It is the case for term limits. Elections may, in theory, be capable of dethroning incumbents, but that isn't how it works in the real world. Congressional incumbents have a 98% re-election rate. That probably explains why Congress looks more like a country club than a melting pot. It's predominantly made up of lawyers and politicians and is disproportionately old, white, rich, and male. Term limits would give us a legislature that better reflects the diversity of our society.
We do have thousands of people who are running volunteer chapters, doing calls into the states where the action's happening, essentially following in the footsteps of the suffragettes who won women's right to vote, of the civil rights advocates who won civil rights for people of color, for marijuana advocates and gay rights advocates and prohibitionists. It doesn't matter what you think about those issues. Historically, these are issues where they went to Washington, D.C., tried to move their agenda, failed, and said, okay, we're going to go to the states.
So term limits is a check on arrogance, it's a check on incumbency, and it's a check on power. It's a way to restore political courage while bringing fresh faces and ideas to Washington. As Ben Franklin said, for the rulers to return among the people was not to degrade them, but to promote them. As Kanye West said, no one man should have all that power.
So we need the states to start applying for a convention, essentially saying, hey, Congress, if you're not going to fix this problem, we're going to fix it.
Never, during any war that we had, whether it's external or internal, during the Great Depression, we never had public debt to GDP over 35 to 40%. World War II was the exception. It was the exception because we were betting the ranch. We saved the free world. We defeated the Axis powers. We avoided attack on our homeland. We prevailed. And after World War II, we restored fiscal sanity. We invested in infrastructure and human capital. We grew the economy much faster than the debt. We didn't pay down the debt. We grew the denominator, debt to GDP, faster than the numerator, and debt to GDP plummeted to around 35 to 40% by 1980.
We will continue along the path toward a balanced budget.
Once it's balanced, we will start paying off the national debt.
And now we are on course for budget surpluses for the next 25 years.
Here's the dilemma we face. Over 80% of Americans want term limits to happen. Donald Trump and Barack Obama want it. It is being blocked purely by the self-interest of Congress. If this were a trial, you all would have to recuse yourselves because there is a colossal conflict of interest. If term limits pass, you won't stay in the limelight forever. You won't be the center of attention. And some people might even stop laughing at your jokes.
1912. 3 things happened in 1912 that expanded the size of government, undercut states' rights. Income tax, Federal Reserve, and in addition to that, the direct election of senators rather than appointment by state legislatures and undercut state rights. 2003, 3 things happened that convinced me that things were out of control. Second round of tax cuts, debt financed. Invaded a sovereign nation without declaring war, debt financed. Expansion of Medicare to include prescription drugs, added $8 trillion in new unfunded obligations when Medicare was already underfunded.
So those hoping to achieve undue influence over policy open the door through campaign funding, then advance the policies they want enacted through lobbying. But how can they be sure of their return on investment? Because unlimited federal debt means there's infinite room in the budget for everyone seeking special favor to get what they want.
Congress has given us $22 trillion in debt, the longest war in American history, a broken healthcare system, a broken immigration system, a tax code written by lobbyists, an explosion of money in politics. Worst of all, too few here have the courage to address these problems because the only focus is on getting reelected. That's why it comes as no surprise that Congress has a 14% approval rating, and 60% of Americans say that they would fire every single member of Congress if they could.
And the founders understood that that could happen. And that's why they put in Article V, where the states would reassert themselves and would do things that Congress should do, but for one reason or another, they failed to do. And therefore, the ultimate power goes back to the people through state legislatures.
Right now, they seem to be accountable solely to special interest and PACs and getting reelected.
I could take this back to 1789. This only goes from 1900. Let me give you the bottom line. Until World War II, the United States never had public debt to GDP more than 35 to 40%.
The message long-term incumbents send to young people like me seems to be, we want you just close enough to the political process to help us win, but don't get too close and take our jobs. The American people have lost confidence in this Congress, and for good reason. We routinely see abuses of power. 18 months ago, it was revealed that members of Congress were secretly using taxpayer money to settle lawsuits, some for sexual harassment. You still haven't disclosed how our money was spent and on whose behalf.
If we don't solve this problem, 3 things are going to happen. Federal taxes are going to go up significantly, and the longer we wait, the higher they're going to go. There'll be fewer state and local grants, and there'll be more unfunded mandates. You think the federal government's going to stand back and say, okay, we're done, we're going to let you do everything? No, they're still going to want you to do things. They're just not going to pay for it.
Congress is less popular than traffic jams, root canals, and hemorrhoids. You're beating head lice, but the lice have asked for a recount. Unfortunately, elections alone cannot fix this problem. Not because voters like you guys so much, but due to the nearly unbreakable power of incumbency. At the same time members of Congress publicly claim elections are free and fair, they secretly deploy every trick in the book to keep power.
Unless we act forcefully, and now, the economy will get worse.
But I pledge to you tonight that the full powers of this government will be used to keep America's economy producing.
What we need is spending discipline in Washington, D.C.
And thus restore balance to our economy.
Incumbents get $9 in special interest money for every dollar that goes to a challenger. And if incumbents are having difficulty raising money, not to worry, they're allowed to send campaign-style mailers at taxpayer expense. That's to say nothing of all the free media and name recognition politicians naturally get just for being in office.
Our government was supposed to be dependent on the people alone. Now it's really just dependent on whoever can afford to influence our politicians.
People talk about deficits. People talk about debt. That's not really the right metrics. What we need to be focused on is debt as a percentage of the economy and how much interest we are paying as a percentage of the budget. Those are the two things that matter.
The provision in the Medicare law that protects skyrocketing drug prices for pharmaceutical companies doesn't come at the cost of a new defense contract or customized tax rates for corporations who lobby for them. There's room in the budget for all of these.
Wolfpack was founded for really just one reason, and that is to get an amendment to the Constitution that makes our elections work better for all of us.
It's a problem at the root of our political system, and it's spreading like a rot through our democracy, and it's called corruption.
What's the future look like? By the way, both these graphics are before the latest COVID-19 legislation, which is about $2 trillion, not counting the stuff that they're talking about now. What are we going to be spending money for in the future based on the Congressional Budget Office? This is before the latest COVID legislation. Interest. And what do you get for interest? Nothing. The status quo is unacceptable and unsustainable. Our country and our family's future is at risk. You need to be part of the solution. We can either conform, we can quit, or we can fight. And I've chosen to fight.
Anything proposed by a convention needs to be approved by 75% of our states afterwards. Congressional Research Service has released, I think, 4 reports at this point. American Bar Association, we have constitutional scholars on the left and the right. They all point to the ratification as being the safeguard, right? That's the bottom line. When people use the word runaway convention, what they're implying is that you can change the Constitution at a convention. And that's just simply not true. The Article V of the US Constitution is crystal clear that a convention can only propose.
And it goes out to the states, and 38 states have got to ratify it. It is the mechanism that the states have to fix a broken Washington. It's the one that the founders gave us specifically for that purpose. And it would cause Congress to become much more accountable to the states and the people than they currently are.
God bless.
You need to be part of the solution. We can either conform, we can quit, or we can fight. And I've chosen to fight.